Well, thank you for joining us. We are going to go through this sort of series through the month of August. We're going to call it into the Bible verse. And so, for the next month, we're just going to be looking kind of at the Bible, more of an aerial view than necessarily all the specifics and details. Because we could spend hours and weeks and months, and people spend years and years and years.
I did that.
We could give certificates out though at the end. Be like, you got.
Well, I mean, so people spend a lifetime doing that. So we're gonna do this through the month of August. So obviously more of an aerial view. And the reason we're doing that is because we really say that how important it is to read the Bible.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I don't know that we do really well necessarily, as I think as communities, as churches, is that we don't really give the people who are reading it's like kind of simple tools that are really helpful for reading and even understanding the Bible. And so a lot of this, I feel like when we put this together, I know for me, it was things that I wish people would have maybe told me when I first started reading the Bible. And that would have been really helpful. Things that I find valuable right now. And just again, this is not a class, so we're not going to get it on the. We've all done college where we've got into the nitty gritties and stuff like that, and we're not going to do that. We're going to give it sort of like a basically more of an overview, things to help us. Again, when it comes to reading the Bible, anything from just kind of again the overarching story to things. Different resources we can turn to that help us in understanding, to just how we have read the Bible that we found really helpful, and just kind of make that a little bit of a discussion. So that is what we are doing. So join us as we go into the Bible verse.
Dun, dun, dun.
We should do like a reverb on that. Into the Bible verse. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think where we're going to start here is simply as this. The Bible is, I know it's going to be weird, it's not a book.
What?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
What is book?
What is book? I've heard of it this way. Andy Stanley calls it a collection of manuscripts. Tim Mackey calls it a library. I really like that. Mm-hmm. And really, the idea is it's a lot of writings collected into this this grouping of a collection of manuscripts, a library, and we actually call those different sections, we call them books. So I think that sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. If you say, "Here's a Bible, go to the book of," you're like, "What?" So that's just
it's
that
bookception.
So the idea is there is an overarching coherent narrative that is the story of God and Jesus, and we'll get more into that in another podcast. But we're starting off with the idea the Bible is not a book. They're manuscripts. They've been written by many different authors, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Over 1,000 plus years.
Yeah.
And again, collected together in what we call the Bible. Then we have the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. And then we also have the New Testament, which is basically kind of starts in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Gospels that tell the story of Jesus, and then sort of life after that. So when it comes to the Old Testament, these were important to Israel, important to their faith, pointing to who God is. Tim Mackey says that basically a lot of these manuscripts were basically written by a lot of the prophets of God. And again, we're getting into authorship to give a little bit more idea of what that means, especially, again, we're dealing with stuff that written over several thousand years ago and over 1,000 years. And then we have the New Testament, which is these were the early writings of the early followers of Jesus. Again, we're talking about this has been written over 1,000 years ago. And it's really important to know that I think this is one of the phrases that I've really come to like when understanding the Bible and this is from Dr. John Walton, who is an author and a professor of Old Testament. He says the Bible was written for us, but the Bible wasn't written to us. I think that's just a really important thing to note as you first sort of like, especially if you're new to reading the Bible, it is written in a different language. We're reading it in English, but it was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek.
With that comes different ideas, different cultures, different sets, that they would understand more than we do, and that's our job to dive in.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to understand, like, it's not just simply a different language. As you said, it's a different culture, which is very different from ours. And obviously there's the obvious differences that come with we being in a modern culture and then in the ancient culture. And I've heard this before, and it's basically the Jetsons and Flintstone effect. And I'm really excited to talk about the Jetsons and Flintstones. Right?
Yabba dabba doo. I'm excited.
Cartoon nerd over here.
That's right. That's what. So basically, the idea of the Jetsons and Flintstones effect is that they were both came out in the '60s, and both of them reflected life in essentially middle America, middle class, blue collar, white America in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So you have one, the Flintstones, set in prehistoric times. You have the Jetsons set approximately 100 years in the future, because just July 31st, they said was actually George Jetson would have been born, and so we still haven't seen our flying cars, so it lied to us.
So did Back to the Future, but that's besides the point.
But the biggest difference in those two, the 60s to prehistoric times to 100 years in the future, is really technology.
Yeah.
And the thing is that so we can think sometimes when we're reading the Bible, think like basically all the value systems and all that are essentially the same. The difference is we drive cars, they rode donkeys. And that's sometimes we can just sort of start to read in. And it's normal to do that. Don't feel bad if you've done it. Everyone does it. But we tend to read in our culture and our understanding and how we see life into that time. And it's really important to realize that that's not necessarily what's exactly the same when we're reading it. There was a different time, different understanding. And yeah, so there's that differences that are more than technology.
Well, it's a lot like we all do that because we can't help it unless we're taught differently. And it's like someone who is learning a different language. You actually have to think differently to learn that language. Yeah. It's not going to be the same necessarily as the way you think about your language. So reading the Bible, it being an ancient document, it's the same idea.
Absolutely. And so we'll hit them. I think what I think is kind of a big difference as far as culture goes is that we in the westernized countries are an individualist culture. In the time of the Bible, they would have been a collectivist culture. So they would have understood things in a more community-oriented way, as opposed to us, who definitely look at it a more individual kind of way. And we're not necessarily sitting here arguing one better than the other. It's just a fact of there are good pluses and minuses everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's just to understand the Bible. It's written by a collectivist culture to a collectivist culture. And that they would have understood things a little bit differently than we would have understood things. Truthfully, one of the things we can do to help us right now is that there are a lot of collectivist cultures still in existence to this day. Again, they're not technically westernized cultures, but we can learn a lot basically to help us understand some of the things with the Bible. But I think just to give us, again, a really quick understanding of that is just how we read Jeremiah 29:11. For anyone who just needs to be reminded of that, it's, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Now, the original readers, would have not taken this as an individual personal thing, because it was actually addressed to a culture and a nation.
Right. So
they may not have took it as this is about me, but they would have said it is about us.
Right.
And we quite often look at that as a little bit more personal. And I do think God wants good things for us. I don't want to knock that out here, but it was really directed to a nation and more of there's a plan for the nation. more so than just a specific individuals in the nation.
Right. And when you actually read that letter, like, these are people in exile being told to actually seek the welfare of the oppressive nation that they're in exile with. Mm-hmm. So there's also that aspect that we, as individualists, we read individual verses with individualist mindsets, and we're forgetting the fact that, like, no, God's actually telling them, like, I have a plan for you, but I'm actually asking you to accept what you're going through.
Yeah.
Be where you are, make the most of it, make the best of it. There's that whole aspect of it too. And without an understanding of a collectivist culture, it's really hard to, because he's saying this is for the better. He's talking about, I got a remnant of the nation that I'm bringing out. I'm not just talking to a single person. This is about a community that I'm going to restore out of something that they caused for themselves.
That's right.
And God is saying, it's almost, I had a professor say, he's like, you were bad. You sit on that stair until I'm ready to let you off, until you've learned your lesson. And you need to learn your lesson by having a good attitude about it.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. It's a really good way to look at it.
I heard one professor in my Bible college who was talking about the importance of when you're preaching. A lot of times it is individualistic, as you said. That's the Western culture. And you can say, you should do this, like Jay or Aaron, myself. But then at the end of your sermon, you can always say what we should do about it as a collective. Mm-hmm. And then it's bringing the whole congregation involved rather than just being like, it's up to just you. And I see the pluses and negatives of both.
Sure.
You want to be able to challenge the individual. You want to be able to challenge the whole congregation to go do something. And that's why I think I read my Bible in a sense that it is about something God speaking to me, but how do I achieve this with others?
Yeah. And so I think and I think those are really great elaborations of getting to this point, because it is, again, looking at that different in culture, and they would not have necessarily looked at this and thought of themselves. They might have said, they might have even looked at it and not necessarily said, I'm going to personally see this, but my kids might, and my grandkids, and
right,
and my ancestors and stuff like that, and that was exciting to them.
Right.
You know, again, more that collectivist kind of idea. So with that understanding, we're different language, different culture. The Bible that we read today is a translation. And there are many different translations. I'm sure, I mean, I read a few of them. Like, you can do the New Living Translation, the NIV, what is it? I've lost that one.
ESV,
New King James Version. There's. I mean, if you go into some of the online Bibles or Bible apps, and you go down there, different translations, it's just, there's a ton of different English translations, much less when you get into translations to many other languages that are around the world.
I enjoy how Bible Gateway does it. I don't know if you guys have seen this. You can actually click so you can have two translations side by side.
Yeah.
So then I'll be like, I like this, how this words it, and then I'll try to like compare and contrast with another translation. And so you can have up to, I think, 3 or 4 different ones. And we did that at our missional community recently because David really likes the amplified version. And then, I'm like, that's great. Let's see what other people like. And then we discuss different words.
Hey, you're giving away another podcast, bro.
Yeah. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay. I'm sorry. I digress. I'm just excited.
So again, we are reading translation. So when you pick up the Bible, whatever you're doing, just know right away you are reading a translation. If you're reading the Old Testament, it was originally in Hebrew and some Aramaic. If you're reading the New Testament, it was in Greek. And so we are reading this English version of that. And so translations are, definitely every translation, whether it's the ESV, the NIV, the NLT, and those are all abbreviations. Like I said, NLT, New Living Translation, ESV, English Standard Version, just all that sort of stuff. And those different translations will bring together a team of scholars, linguists, and all that. And they take the manuscripts, which are, quite often there are many manuscripts of the different scrolls and stuff like that, whether from the Old Testament or New Testament. They're housed in different museums and private collections and stuff like that, and they often have access to to copies of those and stuff like that, pictures and things like that, and then they basically together come up with how it would be translated into the English. And then we have essentially things that are called word for word translations or thought for thought translations. But if we're really honest, there's usually some variation of both, because you can't necessarily just translate necessarily word for a word, just because of how sentence structuring in different languages are so different. Even the Greek would be difficult because there are no punctuation in Greek. So whenever you see any punctuation, or if for those who are a little understanding have maybe read some of the letters of Paul, the run-on sentences,
comma,
the translators would have basically be where they would have done that, because there is no punctuation in ancient Greek. And so sometimes when we're translation, it's just because not only you're translating words, but you're translating sayings that would have been understood in an ancient culture, but not necessarily understood for us here. We would be like, I don't know what that means.
Colloquialisms.
Yes, that's right.
I was going to I should say, when I was in high school, I got in trouble for cheating on French tests, because the way Bishop Carroll worked is you would write your test whenever you're ready, and you would do it on the computer. And for French, I would translate on Google word for word, and the teacher would know that Kyle was in fact cheating because I did it word for word instead of the whole sentence structure. And boy, when she was very quick to find out. But that's how I'm thinking. How, like you said, there's word for word translation, there's sentence structure. You need the sentence. You need the whole story. If you do just one word, it just won't make sense.
Yeah,
I don't know if that analogy makes sense. In my head, it does. In my head, it does.
Just for example, when you have an Exodus, I didn't write this down. I believe it's 34.
It's
verse
Exodus
6.
34.
The Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. Now, when it comes to slow of anger, just so we go on the idea of ways of saying, or figures of speech, it actually says long of nostril. Now, if it was a literal word for word, and even though I'm not sure how it is, how that, and if it was a long of nostril, I'm pretty sure all of us would be like, I don't know what that means.
I was so lost when I was first reading this notes of yours.
What is it? Because it was a saying, and a saying meant someone who's slow to anger. Now, I was thinking, like, we do have sayings that are long of nose, which means you're a nosy person, essentially. I think if someone said long of nostril, we talked about this earlier. We might have thought more Pinocchio, therefore, a liar.
Yeah,
that doesn't make sense. But no, the saying "long of nostril" would have been understood by obviously the person who would have wrote that, but also the people who would originally read that. And so obviously that's what they don't put that literal word for word. It's again that what they mean is slow to anger, and so that's a lot of stuff that is really important to know that's happening a lot in our translations.
Back in high school, we found a board game at my grandma's house from like the 60s called Slang Gang or something. And it was literally like bad slangs from like the 50s. And you're reading them, what does this even mean? Yeah. And I don't remember any of them now because it was so long ago. But I remember being like, you had to guess what it meant. And my grandma got them all. And then there's me who was like, sure. I have no idea what this means. Just different word choices then.
And that's quite often why translations get updated. Like you can get like the New American Standard. You can, if you look, I think it should be under whatever kind of, if you go onto an online Bible, like Bible Gateway, all that, they'll have a 1995 beside one, and then a 2020 besides that. And it's just sort of updating certain things. And some of it is because words do kind of change meaning over time, or just don't become, a common word maybe 40 years ago is kind of unknown. Because I can remember one time when I was a youth pastor and we were reading something in the New King James Version, it said harlot, and they didn't know what that meant. Yeah, and so like words sometimes just sort of are not used normally, and you kind of move it on, and we move it on, so they change it to a word that is just more understandable in the more current kind of vernacular,
right,
and whatnot. So. With that in mind, the translations, Tim Mackie basically encourages us to read a few, to basically to see what they are saying, but ultimately find a translation that is just readable for you. I think it's the basic way to go with that. Definitely, you know, you have different people who have different thoughts of what's more accurate. There's probably some truths and whatnot even in that, but really at the end of the day, find one that is readable to you, because sometimes translations also are about reading level. So if, you know, just like some people who are a little bit more at advanced reading level, they might choose this one because it's going to be more, we'll say more academic for lack of a better word, and something is just more in the idea of common words that are much more used in everyday kind of conversation.
Right.
And stuff like that. So we've talked about, again, there are many different writers and the idea of this in ancient culture. I know this is kind of a big thing for you, Aaron. You know, the idea of authorship and ancient authorship. I mean, we've talked about this many times. So share a little bit with us, just so that will help us understand when we have authors attributed to these many books, 66 books in this collection, in this library called the Bible. Kind of give us a really overview of kind of what, to help us understand that.
Yeah. And I mean, so the biggest thing to keep in mind, and we've harped on this a lot already, it's the individual versus communal, that we see books and something written these days as there's an individual associated with it, and they're the sole person who gets credit. It originated with them, and it's theirs, like property. It's their property, their intellectual property, all this stuff. But whereas in ancient cultures, well, especially in the Bible, there is evidence of ancient stuff that like back in ancient times, there was a time where like there was actually more of an attribution to an individual and their thought. But especially for the Bible and way back in ancient times, it's all communal. And literary property didn't become a thing until the modern era. Right. So we're not trying to like protect someone's intellectual property for copyright reasons here in the Bible. Where an individual is often associated with it, it's that they are the representatives of the tradition. And of the thought. Especially in religious texts, because it's associated with a religious community as opposed to a religious figure. And so, especially in the Bible, that's definitely the case. Like, so if there's a named author of a text, it's just because they're like the original human participant with the Holy Spirit in, like, you know, their personality, their culture, their history and experience that is actually shaping the way the Word of God is coming to the people of God. And the Spirit has continued to work it through the Bible. We believe this, that the Spirit has continued to work this way through the compilation of the Bible and the editing of the Bible and the new editions of manuscripts that we have. We don't have the very first manuscripts.
No, we don't.
The oldest manuscripts are a couple thousand years old. Maybe not even. And so, you know, we tend to think of authors today as like being the sole brilliant individual. That's how Peter Botha talks about it, associating with a single brilliant individual. But even with today's texts, like the authors get the credit, but you still have editors, translators, publishers,
all that
researchers, people working with them to create this book. There's also second and third and fourth editions that adjust the content based on new shifts in culture, new historical events, all that kind of stuff. And the same happened with the Bible. So the history and culture of the wider context is so key to way we understand authorship. For example, like the book of Leviticus, there's scholars that have believed that it's actually a later book, even though it's associated with the tradition of Moses. It's actually a later book closer to the Babylonian exile, that because of what happened, the reason for the exile, it's actually like priests, the priestly tradition calling the people back to the holiness codes that they're supposed to have. Because the reason they were in exile is because they failed to be the holy people of Yahweh, right? So the reality is authorship is vastly more complicated than we understand it today. It's vastly more understanding, even though than we know it to be today as well, even though we still don't get it, that there's more than one person involved in the compilation of a text. But Peter Botha, I think he sums it up the best way when he's talking about New Testament authorship, and I think we can apply this to Old Testament authorship as well, is that authorship in Greco-Roman times must be understood as an interpretive cultural construct. Writing activities were collective and participatory and ranged depending on the location and period. Whatever it was that ancient authors did when they wrote down and diffused thought, authorship in antiquity must not be seen along the lines of modern romanticist projections of the solitary, brilliant individual.
Well, that actually reminds me of something in the Bible Project. I can't remember which gospel directly this was attributed to, but basically it was thought that, whether it was, again, I can't remember if it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but a lot of it was a collection of stories that they got from other disciples, and they were the compiler of those stories, not necessarily they're the ones that wrote,
or even saw all of it.
Yeah, exactly. They just he compiled from different disciples and stuff like that. And just the last thing we want to touch on, again, the idea, because we're coming from a ancient culture, written to an ancient culture, to understand, just like we have many kind of ways or writing styles, that's the same with the culture, and it's kind of get the idea that there are different literary styles present in the Bible. And so Kyle's just gonna share a little bit about that. I mean, again, he enjoys this sort of stuff and a little bit of a Bible nerd himself.
Bible nerds. You already touched on it. As Tim Mackey said, we want to imagine the Bible like going to chapters. There's different sections in each chapters you go to. There's a history section, there's a this section, there's a that section over there. Even the other day I was trying to find the faith section and they moved it, and it just completely confused me. But yeah, that's the same thing with the Bible, that it's a collection of different books with different styles of writing, as you said. So the Bible is the same way. There's narrative, stories. I love stories. I connect with stories. Most of us can actually connect to stories. It kind of reminds me of the Hi-Fi Seminary. We hear a song, we connect well with it. Same way with stories, we put ourselves in there. Mm-hmm. We say, "Ooh, I'm just like that," or "I'm definitely not like this." But you tell your friend over there, you're just like that. I'll leave it up to you to decide where that fits. There's always some type of conflict with that character, maybe. And same way the Bible has that. There's always some type of resolution of some kind. It's a story. You got your beginning, set, middle, and whatnot. Think about the history. Parables use stories. The Gospels are stories. They're narrative. And then there's poetry. And I was thinking about this a lot when I was processing this earlier this week. I hate poetry. I used to hate it so much, and then I should make sure I say I used to hate poetry. And then I had to take a poetry class in university because it was the only English class that fit in my schedule. And I remember the first thing the professor said, "If you're not an English student, you might as well get up and walk out because you'll probably fail." I'm not an English major. So literally I was the only one who was like, and I remember putting up my hand and he's like, "Yes." And I'm like, "I'm not an English major." And he's like, "You're probably going to fail this class." Thanks for the encouragement on my first day, right?
Wow.
Yeah, great guy. But I learned to love poetry. I stuck it out because poetry is invoking of emotion. And I as much as I pretend to be a tough guy or work out so I have muscles and blah, 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 I am such a huge feeler that poetry actually connects with me deeply. And I think that's the place in the Bible it has for it. There's songs. Yeah. They're beautiful. They invoke emotion. They evoke imagination. It takes us to a new place. And I think that's so cool that God uses poetry to do that for us. I like this because we also memorize songs. We memorize poetry. And I know a guy who memorized half the book of Psalms because when he's going through a hard time, he can remember this Psalms. If he's going through a happy moment, he can recite this Psalms. And the last one is this thing called prose discourse. It's kind of like speeches or essays, if you want to compare it to that. It's kind of, there's this big idea, do this, this, and this, therefore this will happen. It's connecting logic of something that someone's talking about and saying this is what you should do because of this. I think of Paul's writing when I hear this, because he oftentimes will say, this is why things are, and this is what you got to do about it. And I think it's so cool that God uses all these in such a way that connects with us today, thousands of years later. The Jewish culture was very much about writing what's important to them, which we kind of touched a little bit on. And this is really important to understand, that just because a style maybe left some questions, it gave an opportunity for them to discover. When
That's
you're
good.
When you're not understanding everything of why something was written, the people would ask questions. They would discuss with one another, what does this mean? I don't understand this. And they would have that communal aspect, as you already touched base on. And I think that's so important in us today, to understand that there's going to be things we don't understand, why this poem was written, why this was written a certain way. And that's okay, because it gives an opportunity to rediscover new things.
Well, I think that's a great way just to maybe end today, even just you saying that. There's another little aspect of the ancient culture to the modern culture. We like it kind of clean at the end, everything ending off with a nice bow on it that makes sense. And the ancient culture, just a very different, again, their culture opposed to ours, are much more, and we said this a couple times, I think, but not necessarily today, but they are much more comfortable in the paradox, in the mystery, and into idea that mystery pulls them in deeper, as opposed to just a definitive, simple, here's the answer, which we like to do. And I'm definitely guilty of that. And again, that's just a very much a cultural difference that's present in the Bible. Because again, I think I want to leave us off with that saying, it definitely was written for us, but the Bible wasn't written to us. It was written to a different culture, but it is for us. And starting to know who God is, and how He wants to interact with us in humanity. All right, thanks for joining us. This was week 1 of Into the Bible Verse.
Dun, dun, dun.